And here's Central China Television's version of the same events as released tonight.
A large number of Hong Kong residents today lined up to take their money out of Chinese banks. They say they want to protest against the Chinese government's military crackdown on student demonstrators over the weekend. Some also said they feared the unstable situation in China would affect their deposits. A Bank of China official today said the banks have enough cash to meet withdrawal demands, but he urged depositors to remain calm and rational. If the Bank of China group is destabilized, it would only affect the territory's economy. In the meantime, Secretary for Monetary Affairs David Nandick says the Hong Kong Bank this morning injected $194 million into the banking system to meet the demand on liquid cash. The money was taken out of the exchange fund. But Nandick says there is no danger of any Chinese banks going under. He called on Hong Kong people to stop making unnecessary withdrawals and urged them to put their money back.
I'm afraid to say that this particular gesture is not only irresponsible, but will not achieve any objective which the people who are using it have in their minds. All it will do is damage our banking system here in Hong Kong, and it will affect people who are borrowing from the banking system, because if the people are withdrawing deposits from the banking system, then the banks themselves may be obliged to call in some of the loans.
The Beijing massacre has unnerved investors throughout Asia and sent stocks crashing. Locally, the Hang Seng Index suffered its worst one-day drop since the global 1987 crash. Lorraine Hahn reports.
Investors tried to dispose of stocks, but buyers were few and far between. Property stocks were worst hit, falling more than 1,000 points, as investors expressed fears about the future of Hong Kong after 1997. The first 10 minutes of trading saw the index plunge 350 points. The vicious slide continued throughout the day, although prices managed later to regain some ground due to bargain hunting and the psychological effect of the 2,000-point barrier. And for the first time since Black Monday, the Hong Kong Bank stepped in to buy some shares. Turnover shrank to just $2.25 billion. Brokers say people are scared. They want out. The chief executive of the stock exchange, Francis Yun, says he'll do his best to maintain an orderly market.
Meanwhile, U.S. President George Bush has announced that all military sales to China will be cut off. He says the U.S. cannot condone the violent attacks on the protesters. He says that requests by Chinese students to remain in the United States will be treated sympathetically. At present, there are about 30,000 Chinese students at American colleges and universities. Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev tonight said more than 600 people may have died in one of the worst train disasters ever. Gorbachev visited the disaster scene soon after it
heard. A Western diplomat said there is solid evidence to back up the reports. It's commonly known the Chinese military was sorely divided on the decision to march into Tiananmen. The source is believed to center on the refusal of the 38th Troop to obey the order to storm Tiananmen Square. They're now being told to take over from the 27th who carried out the massacre. 20 tanks and 15 truckloads of soldiers from the 27th have now taken up combat positions along Beijing's main Changlan Avenue. Meanwhile, more people have been wounded or killed as soldiers continue to spray citizens with automatic gunfire. 4 men were gunned down when 17 truckloads of troops attacked a group of protesters at a road junction. And an 18-year-old girl was shot in the back as a tank chased her up a narrow alley. About 30 tanks have taken up position in an area crammed with foreign embassies, and it is no longer safe to walk the streets there either. China state television has continued extolling the success of the military operation and mourning military casualties. It also showed a film of an attack on a military convoy by a handful of protesters. Broadcast on CCTV today, it shows people stoning a lorry and beating the driver. It was apparently televised to convince Beijing residents that it is the people who are to blame for the violence in the capital and martial law regulations. Civilian casualties are receiving only scant attention, despite the fact that as many as 7,000 people are thought to have died in Saturday night's clash. Meanwhile, in cities across China, where news other than the official version is only just filtering through to residents, outraged people have taken their protests into the streets. Strikes have crippled many cities. In Shanghai, absent bus drivers brought traffic to a standstill, and trains are unable to run through Wuhan, where more than 1,000 protesters are sitting on the tracks. Some military activity has already been seen in those areas. Military aircraft are flying over Wuhan, and in Nanjing, troops have taken up position outside the local university campus. One of the leaders of the Hong Kong Democratic Alliance has reportedly been arrested in Beijing after Chinese security officers stormed the plane carrying him and other Hong Kong residents back to the territory. The report, which was relayed by the plane's pilot to Legislative Councillor Martin Lee, said the officers forced Lee Chuk-yuan off the plane and brought him back to the terminal. The plane was later allowed to take off, but without Mr. Lee. Meanwhile, Amelco members have expressed shock at the bloody events in the Chinese capital. Here's Carolyn Libby.
Senior Executive Councillor Dame Lydia Dunn says the recent violence indicates how different our systems are and says that many of us take our freedoms here for granted.
The events in China have highlighted how very different our two systems are. We in Hong Kong, no matter how angry we are, we must put all our energies into preserving our system, the separateness of our system, in particular, the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press.
Meanwhile, Legislative Councillor Stephen Chong says the Hong Kong Support Alliance's proposal for a one-day strike on Wednesday wouldn't hurt Hong Kong.
Share prices on the local stock market have taken a sharp plunge in the wake of the violence in Beijing. The American President, Mr. Bush, has condemned the military crackdown on pro-democracy demonstrators in Beijing and has ordered an immediate suspension of government military sales and export of weapons to China. Mr. Bush said he deplored the decision to use force against the demonstrators and urged the Chinese government to return to its past policy of restraint. Meanwhile, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Geoffrey Howe, has summoned a senior Chinese diplomat in London to register Britain's concerns about the bloody suppression of student demonstrators in Beijing. In another development, the British Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee says it is reconsidering its recommendations for a report on the future of Hong Kong. It says the rethink is necessary because of the bloody military crackdown in Beijing. The chairman of the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee, which is 2 months into a report on the implementation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, claims the Chinese government's handling of the 7-week-old student protest has thrown their recommendations into chaos. Conservative David Howell claims it would be impossible not to take serious note of the way the troops stormed into the capital, killing thousands in response to what was essentially a peaceful demonstration. However, the committee still intends to submit its final report on time this July. And Mr. Howell feels, however awful the situation in China, it may well mean their report is viewed much more favourably by Parliament than was originally expected. Meanwhile, the government has set up a hotline for people worried about the safety of friends or relatives currently in Beijing. The number to call is Hong Kong side 869-1313. Hong Kong side 869-1313. Well, that's all for tonight.
120幾個喺北京嘅本港居民同埋記者接載返香港。飛機1個鐘頭之前安全降落喺啟德機場，而乘客咧而家係陸續出閘，機上面個個人都全部安全㗎。而全港市民支援愛國民主運動聯合會去北京代表團嘅成員之一嘅李卓人，本來亦都係坐呢一班機㗎。不過佢上咗飛機之後，就俾北京嘅公安人員由飛機上面帶走。李卓人呢係大約1個禮拜之前帶同支聯會嘅捐款去到北京同學生接觸。